On April 4th, 1968, while in Memphis organizing to support the city's striking sanitation workers over poor pay and abhorrent working conditions, Dr. King was assassinated, shot from across the street while standing on the balcony of room 306 of the Lorraine Motel. Dr. King's assassination shocked the nation, but his memory and legacy lives on, reminding us year after year of our moral responsibility to lead lives rooted in love and a yearning for justice in our world. There's such power in the ways in which we memorialize others, the stories we tell about their lives, the meaning that we make of their legacies. In mainstream America, Dr. King's legacy has been largely confined to the sentiment expressed in the final, famously improvised paragraphs of his I Have a Dream speech. And it is true, Dr. King envisioned a world where, quote, children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. But his vision was much deeper. Dr. King envisioned a world free of injustice, of poverty, of militarism, of any form of institutionalized marginalization and exploitation. He believed deeply in building people power and in the strategic use of nonviolent protest to force society to address the moral crises of his time. His vision was bold and radical, and the National Civil Rights Museum truly highlights that legacy. On April 4th, 1967, exactly 1 year before his assassination, Dr. King delivered a riveting speech at Riverside Church in Harlem entitled Beyond Vietnam. In his remarks, Dr. King did not hold back his criticism of the war. He dove deeper, stating that the war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. He went on to acknowledge the links between poverty, war, racism, and America's extractive economy. He proclaimed that, quote, we must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a people-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, militarism, and materialism are incapable of being conquered. Dr. King teaches us here that all struggles for justice and equity are interconnected and so often stem from the same root causes. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Dr. King wrote, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Dr. King's warning and his vision could not be more prophetic and prescient as we enter 2019. I could easily spend the rest of the evening highlighting the dire interconnected challenges that lay before us. And just to ground us in the present, I'll share a little snapshot. In the United States today, the gap between the richest of the rich and everyone else continues to widen. 1% of the global population currently own 45% of the world's wealth. Racism still thrives in America. Black families own 10 cents in wealth to every white family's dollar. Studies demonstrate unequivocal bias against people of color that limits access to housing, education, employment, and fair treatment in the criminal justice system. Mass incarceration has been referred to as the new Jim Crow. In America, over 2.5 million, mostly nonviolent Black and brown Americans are currently living behind bars. We are witnessing the reemergence of white nationalism and explicit acts of racial violence. Lives are being stolen by hate-fueled mass shootings, and there's the inhumanity of the family separations at the Mexican border and the cruel irony that most of those advocating for walls and closed borders are descendants of immigrants who came to this country to flee persecution. We are witnessing the rise of authoritarianism worldwide and the dangerous erosion of democracy. Politics polluted with corporate cash and new laws designed to silence opposition and criminalize protest. Not to mention the fires and megastorms and droughts and loss of species that define our ever-escalating climate crisis. And how each subsequent climate report warns us that we are barreling perilously down a path towards mass extinction and mass displacement. The list goes on. I spent the first few months of the Trump era struggling to get out of bed in the morning. I would open my eyes, grab my phone, open the news, and spiral into an almost hypnotic paralysis. The weight of the world seemed to crush my will to function. Can anyone else here relate to that feeling? So how do we make sense of the cataclysmic times that we're living in without succumbing to this paralysis? What does Dr. King teach us about how we should go about our lives given the urgency of so many crises? How do we harness hope and courage to act in the darkest of times? I found one answer at the Civil Rights Museum at the Lorraine. What spoke to me most about the museum was its focus on the legacy and power of Black resistance to oppression, dating back to the earliest slave revolts to the Underground Railroad to the abolition of slavery, continuing through the Civil Rights Movement to the movement for Black Lives. The exhibit walls pulse with stories of courageous and principled people who, despite facing seemingly insurmountable obstacles and great personal risk, chose to confront the world as it was with a steadfast conviction that there is a better path. The thread that weaves these stories together, the thread that has built and sustained all of these movements for justice throughout history, is love. And the kind of love I'm talking about is not the sentimental, affectionate love that we celebrate on February 14th. The love I'm talking about is Dr. King's interpretation of agape, one of the Greek words for love. To Dr. King, agape is simply, quote, love in action, seeking to preserve and create community. It is insistence on community even when one seeks to break it. King continues, and I use gender-neutral language. Quote, agape means a recognition of the fact that all life is interrelated. All humanity is involved in a single process, and all people are siblings. To the degree that I harm my sibling, no matter what they are doing to me, to that extent, I am harming myself. In sum, love in the Kingian tradition is the pursuit of justice rooted in an understanding that all life is interconnected. This type of love is bold, radical, and potent. This type of love is the antidote to the rise of hatred, xenophobia, and violence that is landing kids in caskets when they should be in classrooms, that's ripping families apart when they should be together, that's stoking calls for walls when we really need our bridges. This type of love drives traumatized students to march for their lives, leads indigenous elders to stand in front of bulldozers, inspires caravans of volunteers to offer aid to migrants at the border. This type of love is unbreakable. It is perhaps the greatest asset to the human spirit. This type of love must melt our own paralysis. The forces of white supremacy, of male supremacy, of inequality and injustice are powerful and always at work within ourselves, within our communities, within the broader world. We live in a country grappling with a 400-year history of slavery and colonization, of male dominance and institutionalized violence. We inherited this legacy. So the question is, what does it mean for us, given all this, on an individual level, to practice agape in our own lives? How can we find our role in the struggle for justice? See, each and every moment presents us with the opportunity for transformation, for inspired action. When it comes to issues of social justice, I believe that there is no such thing as neutrality, as sitting on the sidelines. Think of the forces of racism and white supremacy as a powerful river. Those of us who enjoy unearned benefits as a result of being white can be swept along each day, choosing to accept those benefits and perpetuate business as usual. The same can be said of those of us who receive unearned advantages as a result of being male, or heterosexual, or able-bodied, or having a US passport. We are swept downriver, barely noticing those in the margins who are struggling against the current, straining to stay afloat. And I'm not suggesting that anyone who receives unearned benefits on account of their identity are racist, bad people. But in America, we are taught often that racism only functions as individual acts of bigotry. We've all heard and been horrified at the stories in the news. Let's take one incident, an example in April 2018, where police were called to arrest two black men who were simply sitting in a Philadelphia Starbucks waiting for a business meeting. The incident and countless others like it caused an uproar, as it should. Acts of prejudice and bigotry are disturbing and dehumanizing and illustrative of how deep the poison of racism runs in America's veins. However, understanding racism only at the interpersonal level accomplishes two things that actually serve to prop up white supremacy. First, it blinds us from all of the institutional and structural ways that racism operates to grant unearned power and advantages to white folks at the expense of people of color. And second, it allows us to relieve ourselves of our own individual responsibility to challenge those power structures. We can point at the Starbucks manager and say, wow, look at that racist. I would never do something so horrible. Seeing racism in this narrow way actually strips us of our power to understand how we can work to dismantle racism and other forms of oppression within ourselves, our families, workplaces, and communities. So here's what I'm suggesting. That it is up to each of us to reflect upon, with humility, an open mind, and an open heart, the ways in which our identities afford us unearned advantages, while others might simultaneously present us with roadblocks in life that only exist because of our identities. What I'm referring to is the often misunderstood notion of privilege and oppression. So here are a few examples in my own life. As a man, I'm able to walk down the street at night without fear of sexual harassment or assault. I'm able to speak up in meetings and have the reasonable expectation that my opinions will be heard and respected. I can navigate the world without worry that my value to others will be tied implicitly or explicitly to my physical appearance. As a white person, I can walk confidently into a store without being labeled as suspicious and followed. I am able to have the reasonable expectation that police officers will treat me with dignity and respect. I'm able to apply for work or housing without worrying that opportunities will be denied because of implicit bias. Most of my white friends and family members have never had to grapple with the pain of having a loved one incarcerated. And if I so choose, I'm able to run for public office without fear of racial harassment. I know that one rings fairly true to recent news here in Vermont. At the same time, as a Jewish person, I have many times in my life been reminded that I live in a society dominated by Christianity, that often renders my values, history, and traditions as unimportant or invisible. I have dealt with the terror that maybe my family's synagogue will be the target of the next horrendous hate crime. And why do I raise all this? It's not to stoke fear or guilt or shame, because that's really just not useful. For me, understanding my own position in society has actually been liberating. By examining and owning how my own identities come with unearned access and roadblocks, it opens me up to act for justice with humility and clarity. I would argue that engaging in the lifelong practice of critical self-reflection is agape. It's making the decision each and every day that love for community and love for justice is more important than protecting our egos. In my current role with Earthworks, I work alongside Indigenous leaders, people of color, rural folks, and poor communities who are impacted by big oil and gas companies. The communities I serve are targeted by industry because they are perceived to be the most powerless to oppose the theft of their land or the poisoning of their air and water. I've seen companies permanently pollute homeowners' well water. I've seen companies bully and bulldoze through landowners' property without permission, cause fires and explosion that have resulted in loss of life, and target those who attempt to say no with surveillance, intimidation, and in some cases, physical violence. I've seen a grandmother thrown in jail for months. I've seen Indigenous women being beaten by off-duty police officers on a company's private payroll. I've sat in the living room of an elderly couple whose water has been running a foul brown for 2 years. The specific citing of environmental hazards in communities of color is called environmental racism. And I'm happy to share specific stories and answer questions about this work later on. But in the course of doing this work and outside of work, I constantly ask myself, how can I leverage the privileges and access that I have to help amplify the voices of those most impacted by the compounding forces of racism, classism, and environmental destruction? So on a personal level, that means making sure I challenge my own implicit biases, that I take the time to learn the history, culture, and values of the people I work with, and that I act with humility and listen to others. On an interpersonal level, this means lovingly but firmly challenging racist or misogynistic behavior when I see it. It means having courageous conversations with other white folks about racism, other men about sexism, about how we can be stronger allies for justice. And on an institutional level, it means critically examining the policies and practices at my workplace and engaging my colleagues to make our organization a more equitable place to work. It means centering the needs and priorities of people impacted by the issues I work on when organizing campaigns. It means being politically engaged well beyond the bare minimum of voting in elections and supporting others to harness their own agency over decisions that impact their lives, families, and communities. So this is the charge I leave with you all tonight, to take a look inward, to have courageous, loving conversations in your homes, in your communities of faith, to ask yourself, what can I do to embody agape in my home, in my workplace, in my community? Like fish that realize we are swimming in water, may we live each day with open eyes, humble hearts, and harness the courage and audacity to act. May we all, in honoring the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., model agape in every aspect of our lives. Dr. King concluded his Beyond Vietnam speech by declaring that we are now faced with the fact, my friends, that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. These words could not ring with more veracity in the present moment. So I'll close with the words of the great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world.